All right, welcome back. We're going to pick up with part two of the Athenian Golden Age here in our unit on classical Greece. So, we had just been talking about two of the most famous city-states of ancient Greece, Athens and Sparta. And eventually, these two city-states go to war, in a war known as the Peloponnesian War. The war gets its name because of the piece of land they fight on called Peloponnesus, which I'll show you here momentarily. This war was fought in a way because of jealousy, and that's maybe a too simplified version of this story. But as Athens grew, a lot of the city states started to view it with hostility. Athens really kind of thumbed its nose at everybody else, kind of thought it was better than everybody else because of its philosophy, because of its democracy, because of its navy, because of its architecture. There's a lot of things Athens really had going for it. However, not all the other city states appreciated that. So basically, what happens here is Sparta says, we're going to take you down a notch. We're going to knock you down a peg. So Sparta declared war on Athens in 431 BC. One of the things that the Spartans did first is they marched to Athens and they started burning the Athenian food supply. And that's a really interesting tactic in warfare. Because what you're doing is you're starving them out. You're hurting their supplies. You're weakening them from the inside, and that's definitely going to pay dividends here a little bit later. But there's also sort of a stroke of luck if you look at it from the Spartan standpoint. Certainly is bad luck if you look at it from the Athenian standpoint. But plague hits Athens in the second year of the war. You've got an outbreak of a deadly disease. 1/3 of the entire city dies by this plague. Even Pericles himself dies of plague. So not only are you burning their food supply, but now you've got disease that hits the Athenians. They're definitely going to be weakened. That doesn't mean this war is going to end quickly, though, as you're going to find out. This actually goes on for a number of years. So we get 10 years into this war in 421 BC, and a truce is signed, thinking the war is over, that this is going to be wrapping up here sometime soon. But it doesn't work out that way. Another 8 years passes. In 413 BC, Athens' navy is decimated at a place called Syracuse. Basically, Syracuse is a Spartan ally. Athens goes there to try to hurt them. It backfires, and the Athenian navy is hit really, really hard here. So now we're 18 years into this war, and Athens is still kind of getting their hat handed to them, but they're hanging on. They're definitely hanging on even still. So Athens survives for another 9 more years, but eventually surrenders to Sparta in 404 BC. So this thing lasts for about 27 years. And really, what this doesn't mean, we should make this very clear, is it doesn't mean that Sparta is taking over Athens. It's a war of might. It's a war of pride. It's not a war of conquest. So Sparta is not in this to take over Athens. Like I said, we would say it is you're kind of trying to knock them down a peg. They're definitely trying to take that pride and reputation away from Athens. And for a time, it actually worked. So the Athenian army and navy were hit pretty hard in the Peloponnesian War, and Sparta wins. Here's a map of what we're looking at here. Everything that's in this orange color were allies of Athens. Everything that's in this pink color are allies of Sparta. And so this Peloponnesus piece of land right here is where most of this war would have been fought. Naturally, it's kind of a good middle ground between Athens here and Sparta here. So that's kind of where we're looking at specifically with the Peloponnesian War. Now, one of the results of this war is people start to question things. When things go bad, humankind tends to dissect it, we reflect, we try to improve upon everything. You know, if you get a bad grade in the class, ideally you would go back and say, why did I get a bad grade? And you would try to improve the next time around, whether it's on a test or a project or a paper. Well, in a lot of ways, that's sort of what happened here in Athens. After the Peloponnesian War, many Athenians lost their confidence in democracy. In a lot of ways, democracy became the scapegoat for the loss in the Peloponnesian War. So great thinkers, known as philosophers, began to start seeking truth. And this is going to be so revolutionary that there's going to be people in this time period that didn't quite recognize how important these philosophers truly were, not only for Greece, but for mankind, because we still follow a lot of the ideas that these philosophers laid down today. They really started to try to look at everything and understand it, rather than just saying, oh, Poseidon did this, or Zeus did that, or have some type of spin on it from the god's point of view. But we start looking at things and trying to understand how things work, how things grow, how things are. And that comes from philosophy here from ancient Greece. So the philosophers, or lovers of wisdom, had two assumptions about the world. The first assumption is that the universe is put together in an orderly way and subject to absolute and unchanging laws. That describes physics. And people at this time didn't have a great understanding of physics. After all, we hadn't even had a theory or a property about gravity yet during this time period. I mean, you knew if you threw something up in the air, it would come back down, but nobody really knew why. So you have to really kind of take what we know out of this equation and look at this from the eyes of an Athenian and say, wow, this is really amazing. I mean, we know that if you look at your desk or you look at your paper or your pencil, that's made up of atoms and neutrons, electrons, and all that stuff that I probably don't know enough about. And they didn't know that, though. And so to say this, that the universe is put together in an orderly way and that there's absolute unchanging laws, they're hitting it right on the head long before a lot of these properties were ever discovered and truly understood. The second assumption that they made about the world is people can understand these laws through logic and reason. Logic and reason are really important. We stress this in everything we do today. I mean, if you want to, again, I'm going to go back to, getting a grade in a class. If you want to succeed, you have to start going, what is it that I'm doing wrong? What do I have to improve upon? How can the teacher help me get a better grade? That's using logic and reason to try to come up with an answer. Don't just sit around and assume, well, the teacher's a lousy teacher and I'm lazy or I'm not smart enough. No. That's taking the easy way out. Using logic and reason is looking at any problem and trying to truly understand it. And again, if you take the gods out of it, saying, it's Poseidon's fault that I'm not getting a good grade in this class, then you're not thinking like a philosopher. You're thinking like an ancient Greek, but not a Greek philosopher. So this is revolutionary stuff that they came up with. There are three main philosophers that really pioneered this way of thinking. And we're going to look at them very, very briefly here. The first one is Socrates. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And think about that, unexamined life. I mean, he wanted to look at everything. He wanted to understand everything. He wanted to know how things work. I think Socrates would have been the kind of guy that if you gave him a Nintendo DS, he would have taken it apart just to see what was inside of it, just to see how everything kind of worked together. So he really was interested in examining and understanding the world around him. Problem was, people really didn't appreciate him in his time. Some of these ways of thinking were just so new to people that they really couldn't grasp it. So in 399 BC, Socrates was brought to trial for corrupting the youth of Athens. That's what the charge was. And they found him guilty. Sadly, one of the greatest thinkers we've ever had was actually put on trial and condemned to die. So a jury condemned him to die and forced him to drink hemlock, which is a poison. You can see this image here. This is the death of Socrates. And he didn't fight it. He knew that this was a law that was, to be followed. And so when he was told to drink the hemlock, he took it and he drank it and he died. And it's really sad because Socrates, I think, really is responsible for giving us the way of thinking that we have today. The good news is, though, despite his death, he had followers. For example, Plato. Plato was definitely a student of Socrates, and one of the things that Plato gives us is a book called The Republic. And he talked a lot about governing. And the Republic was really about a perfectly governed society. And so he continued to preach on the ideas that Socrates had come up with, and people learned from both Socrates and Plato. So there's no doubt that his ideas lived on. He had a very important pupil. His pupil was Aristotle, and Aristotle is going to be our third and last philosopher that we're going to talk about here. Aristotle got a lot of things wrong, but he also got some things right. He questioned the nature of the world, which is very much what we've been talking about this whole time, using logic and reason to question everything that's out there. These kind of guys would have been the guys that look at a blade of grass and would have asked, why is this grass green? They wouldn't have assumed that one of the gods made it green. They would have assumed there's some chemical property inside of it that makes it green. Of course, we know way more about that today than they ever did, but that's the kind of question that they would have asked. Aristotle invented the method of arguing according to the rules of logic. And this really kind of provided the basis of the scientific method today. For those of you who've taken science class, you know how the scientific method works. You write a hypothesis, you test it, and you retest it, and you try to come to some kind of conclusion. And so Aristotle's work really kind of helped pioneer the scientific method that we use in science today. His famous pupil was Alexander the Great. And of course, Alexander the Great is going to be our last learning outcome for this unit. We're going to see how the Persian Empire and the Greek civilization comes to an end under Alexander here at the end of this unit. So as we wrap up here, we're coming back to our constructive response question. The question simply says, describe the Athenian Golden Age. Well, we know the Athenian Golden Age had a lot to do with the defeat of the Persians. Now that the Athenians and the rest of the Greeks, for that matter, are free of their potential invading overlords, they have the opportunity to focus on themselves. So we saw the glorification of Athens with Pericles building up the empire, building up the Parthenon, certainly introducing direct democracy. Those are huge parts of the Athenian Golden Age. Certainly we need to talk about the philosophers. Looking at Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates and their ideas. We can also mention a little bit about Sparta here, because Sparta looked at Athens with, I wouldn't say necessarily envy, but more so with a little bit of anger. Athens really kind of thumbed their nose at a lot of different people, so Sparta just said, hey, let's go knock them down a peg, and they declared war, and that's the resulting war was the Peloponnesian War. So the Athenian Golden Age has multiple levels to it, all of which we covered here in this lecture. So you have a lot of good information you can use to answer that question. So rate yourself on a 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. 4 is I can answer this question, I get it, I can write a good paragraph on it. 3 is I would probably be pretty close. 2 is I need some work, and 1 is I barely understood any of it. So it's always good to self-assess and know where you're at. So go ahead and give yourself a score on that, and then go ahead and practice this question. So that's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.